Feels muted. I feel muted. So Clint and I just did a talk on world building at the second virtual and 8th year of NanoCon, LCC's Science Fiction and Nerdfest convention. When we started our conversation, so we nerded out for about 3 to 4 hours kind of preparing for this talk and just free associated all sorts of ideas. But when we started talking about ourselves, we discovered that there's a world that we live in that has created us. And it was a good way to think about fictional characters that are created by their worlds and that exist within their worlds.
Yeah, that's a fair thing to say. One of the things that we'll assert is that character and setting are inseparable. That as you envision a story, whether that's a fictional story or a creative nonfiction story, right, your sense of place is tied up with who you are and who the people are who live in that place. And those things all have influence on the events that unfold in the story, whatever that story might be. So whether your thing is envisioning creating a fictional world for a story that you want to write, or if you're developing something for like a scenario for a role-playing game, or even if you just are thinking about writing something autobiographical, sharing your own story, having a good sense of place, of the setting is going to be helpful for bringing people into that world and making it feel real to them, and enabling them to better understand the characters and the history and how all those things are tied together.
And then your characters are of course going to talk about their world. You know, as Courtney said in her introduction, I moved here from Michigan in 2017. And if you knew me, you would know that within the first few minutes of knowing me, I mention it a lot because it's part of who I am. Just like Conan the Barbarian will frequently tell you he's from Sumeria up in the north, and make references to his sort of his god. He doesn't really worship the god quite as much as he invokes the god Crom all the time in his travels. So, you know, sense of place shapes us. So one of the interesting things about the fact that I just moved to Kalama is that shortly after we moved here, I all of a sudden had this idea for a novel that would be a murder mystery type story. And for some reason, I was drawn to Kalama, probably because, and I didn't realize this immediately, I don't know why, I'm from Kalamazoo, Michigan, and that's all the letters of Kalama except the zoo. Whoa, oh, it's really wanted my microphone. And so before we had decided to move to Kalama, I used channels, i.e. one of my students here that works at Public Works and is a resident of Kalama, to get a tour of the high school. So I was really drawn to the high school, and everybody told me, of course, that Twilight, scenes from Twilight was filmed there. So I got this big tour of the high school because seeing where the story would be set is going to trigger ideas for what I do in the story. So when we talk about this, really is there like a magnet here? I'm going to step away from the board. So you can have stories that are obviously they're set in our world, even though I'm going to take liberties with Kalama and change things. So it's not going to be geographically and detail perfect. But you can also create stories that are set in other worlds, which is really what we were thinking about when we wanted to do this talk.
Yeah, not just thinking about setting and how it's interacting with our lecture right now.
Stay away from the board.
That's funny. Yeah, so one of the first things that I envisioned, because I watch a lot of anime, was how often in a fantasy setting in anime, we see an establishing shot where there's a huge city, like some sort of medieval city. And these are often these concentric ringed cities with these, you know, different layers of walls around the cities. And I thought, just that simple image, what does that tell us about both the setting and the history of this place? right? If we have walls, it means that we are, these are probably military defensive fortifications. And if there's several rings, it means that the city has evolved over time to grow and to expand. And so therefore to have to, establish larger walls. That already tells you something about the history of not only that place, but other places in relation to this place. And what do characters have to go through to grow up in a town like that, as opposed to some village out in the middle of nowhere with no walls and just agriculture? And so that's going to have an influence on the kinds of personality that you're going to see your characters develop, the sorts of things that they know, and the kinds of practices that are normal for people who grow up in that culture. So the physical geography of place is one of the factors that you'll consider as you're establishing the details of your setting. As Chris points out here in this slide, writers often make maps to sort of visualize where things are laid out in the world, right, relative to each other. And this doesn't necessarily just have to be like on a planet. You can think of the physical geography of, say, the Starship Enterprise and how the different locations relative to each other on that spaceship have an influence on how the plot can unfold and where the characters are and how they interact with each other.
When we were preparing for this talk and kind of nerding out about our various experiences with science fiction, fantasy, and worlds and that sort of thing, I was reminded of this because recently, so name drop, read a book by Jeff Vandermeer, author of Annihilation. It was made into a film with Natalie Portman, called Wonder Book, and it's an excellent book about writing these kinds of stories. There's a whole section on world building, and there's snippets from other authors like Lev Grossman, Ursula K. Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Nnedi Okorafor, that are in here as well. Excellent book if you're interested in this kind of stuff. But so we're talking about this, and one of the things that was mentioned in there is that often writers, when they're creating their own worlds, one of the first things they do is make a map. And I don't know if you're all acquainted with the most famous role-playing game of all time, Dungeons and Dragons, but it was invented back in the 70s, and it was really intended to give characters to the miniatures in their war games. So you had a bunch of these people that like to play these military war games, and they would recreate famous historical battles with all these little lead miniatures. They'd move around a big board, and often the boards would cover a huge table. And they thought, well, what if we did the Lord of the Rings battles, and what if we gave some of these miniatures actual characters of, Frodo and Gandalf and so on, and how do we define what they're able to do? Because there's rules in the game, right? So they had to come up with these rules, and that's kind of where D&D came from. And it evolved into this thing where you design a character that you play in this world, and someone creates a world. Usually this person is known as the dungeon master because the focus of the game is going into dungeons to look for loot and kill off monsters that are protecting the loot. So the first time I ever played was shortly after Dungeons and Dragons had been invented. We didn't have the rule books yet. The rule books had just been published, but my friend had gone to a game and played it, but he hadn't been able to purchase the rule books yet. There was no internet. Or at least no internet we had access to. So it's like I could just jump on my phone. I didn't have a phone I carried around with me. This is back in ancient times when we used to, carve our writings into stone tablets and had to cart them around. So he shows up in my house, and we're in our teens. And he has a pocket full of dice, because there's all these cool dice that you get to play the game, 20-sided dice to create a number between 1 and 20 and so on. And he had drawn a map. And he had memorized the wandering monster table, which is this way to generate, if you're out in the wilderness, what kind of monster may set upon you and try to kill you. And there's like a 1 in 6 chance that's going to happen every hour, so dice to roll, every hour. It's very exciting. But it's one of the best games I'd ever played because, we're just kind of winging the rules. And we had a map. My character falls down a pit, breaks his leg, and then how does he get out of the pit with a broken leg? I had some rope, but I don't even know if I had a grappling hook. So one of the things that we talked about, this is a long way to get back to this, was where do you start? So you always have a starting point. for the story. Sometimes it's a map. And so you have this sense of the world and this sense of place, but other times you might have another starting point. Like,
yeah, thinking about these different elements of setting. I'm just thinking about your joy in having this role-playing experience because you're exploring the world, right? You're exploring the setting, and that's giving you the framework within which to have these adventures. Any of these decisions can lead to, through connected ideas, to other decisions. And so thinking about any of these elements that would make up a setting can be a starting point or a seed for your creativity, for growing your ideas into other other places. Just like how we talked about the walls of the city suggest something about its history and its relationship with its neighbors. Something that Chris talked about at NanoCon was a magic system. How does the magic system in your world work, and what is the price of power? What kinds of things do you have to do in order to get the magic to work? One interesting element might be maybe you have to sacrifice a body part. Maybe you don't have control over what that is, depending on what the magic is, right? But the establishing the rules of the setting, how things work in this setting. What are the mechanisms of power in various ways? What are the nations? Where are things located? What kinds of politics or government do they have? And certainly they don't have to all have the same. That makes it more interesting if there are differences there that might lead to conflict. Military, economics. Speaking of economics and military corporations, we see, especially in dystopian science fiction, like the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, the shirt that I'm wearing today, whose slogan is "Building Better Worlds." So that's why I had to wear this one today. But even the Weyland-Yutani Corporation is interested in like military contracts, and so we didn't give the spoiler warning, but we're going to be spoiling some fictional stories
we're
here.
Try to not spoil too much, but we are going to reference things and spoil it a little bit.
But the Weyland-Yutani Corporation in Alien was interested in acquiring these alien creatures because that might lead to military technologies and profit, right? And Carter J. Burke, our corporate antagonist in the show, that's a bit of a spoiler too. He ends up betraying the other characters because he's trying to arrange to get this alien smuggled back to the core world so they can research it.
That movie's been out for a really long time.
Yeah.
He's talking about Aliens.
Aliens in
and the character
1986.
played by Paul Reiser in that.
Brilliant scumbag.
Yeah. It was Paul Reiser, wasn't it?
It was Paul Reiser. Yeah.
It was
From Mad About
You. Yeah.
I think it was post Mad About You. I think, wasn't it?
No.
Was it pre? Maybe it was pre. Okay.
Pre Mad About You.
Yeah, you're right. Helen Hunt and Paul Reiser got their stardom from that. Yeah.
Which is a whole nother subject.
But there's another setting we could talk about. But thinking about the technology involved, right? What levels of technology are there? Who has access to certain technologies? And so, technology and magic are just different facets of how people in the world can have access to power, to getting things done. Exerting their will on their environment. That's sort of one cluster of elements of fiction to think about. Another cluster might involve cosmology. What's the origin of everything in this world? What does everything come from? What do people believe are the origins of their world, which might not align with the truth of where things came from, right? Different groups might have different belief systems, which leads to like religious beliefs and philosophical beliefs. History and mythology, common knowledge, whether that common knowledge is true or false. I'm currently teaching Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, and in this book, every other chapter or so, she sort of steps away from the main narrative and presents us with a myth or a legend or some sort of story that a character has recorded another character saying, and this is giving our main character, our protagonist, who's like an ambassador from outside of this world, insights into who these people are and why they think the way they do and what the history of these people is. Another cluster that is sort of related to that is language. What are the languages people speak? What kinds of terminology might lead us to some insights about the people and where they come from and what their cultural practices are? What sorts of language things are taboos as opposed to expectations. Terminology is often helpful in establishing a seemingly alien setting, whether that's fantasy or whether that's science fiction or whatever it might be, even if it's just like a modern day dramatic setting, but we're talking about the uses of certain language that clues us into, orients us to where we're at. Like if we have like people talking in engineering terms or certain kinds of jargon, then that's going to tell us a lot about who those people are and what that setting is. But not too much unfamiliar terminology for your readers, right? Because you want them to be able to make sense of what's going on in the story and be able to infer some of those meanings from context if they're not too familiar with them. Spiritual practices, another element of setting. Next cluster will be food and customs. Food is really important, especially like in anime shows, but practically anywhere you go, you'll see characters either gathering around food, or the inability to get adequate food can be a crucial plot device. How available food is and what kind of food it is, that's going to tell you a lot about people as well. You know, what are their eating practices and customs.
One of the things that is common in creating stories like this is that a writer has to figure out how to deliver this information about the world, right? So as Clinton just mentioned, with Left Hand of Darkness, Le Guin creates sort of a mechanism to do an info dump frequently throughout the novel, you know, and an info dump is just literally what it sounds like. The author is going to dump information on you, which is typically a practice that a writer's advised not to do, because readers don't always want to wade through a long expository section explaining stuff about the world, right? But a masterful author like Le Guin is going to make it work and make it engaging and probably keep it relatively short-ish,
Yeah.
so that it gets back to the story that, you know, that's driving the plot
typically,
and all those sorts of things.
In this novel especially, she's artistic in how to do that, because she's telling a story about characters that are just not our main characters, but you know, the info dump is taking place through a narrative that makes it palatable and not just information. Yeah.
So most of you writers are going to create a large body of information about the world in which the story takes place, that they only reveal some of that to the readers. And so like what Clint was just talking about, where food is concerned, there's one author, and I really wish I could remember who it is, but always figures out all of the regular mundane things about the lives of the characters in the world, what they eat, how they dress, how they decorate their homes, you know, where they go to the bathroom, what they sleep on, what they do first thing in the morning, you know, and that will then, of course, start to evolve into spiritual practices or other kinds of cultural customs.
You're reminding me of J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series. I mean, she's got volumes of information that she's developed about the world that are only barely exposed to you through the stories, but it's because she has such a rich understanding of that setting that these things can seem ordinary, and they can all just be natural components of the story as it's being told.
And one of the things that I think readers really love about stories that take place in other worlds and world building, and J.K. Rowling is on my list here as a good example of someone that makes up all these specific details that then keep coming back consistently throughout the stories, so that readers can rely on those. And this is often the beginning of world building, because, like, for instance, we were talking about stories that have obviously evolved from a writer doing a lot of work to build the world, say like Tolkien, who we know wrote, you know, and they published posthumously basically all of his notes and preparations that went into Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but mostly Lord of the Rings. But then other stories that may have just sort of been thrown together on the fly. We were thinking of Star Trek, the original series. and then suddenly readers like started to attach themselves to that world. They started to believe in that world. They started to expect the world to have an internal logic and to make sense. They wanted the backstory on Klingons and Romulans and Tribbles and whatnot. And I think the creators of Star Trek were like, oh no, now we have to think up all this stuff, because now all of a sudden you have viewers, I might have said readers, but I mean, eventually there were books. You know, they're dressing up in the uniforms from the TV show. They were making their own replicas. This is before.
They're creating their own characters and expanding the setting.
Yeah. And they'd host these conventions where, you know, they have like created their own fan starship that has a name, and they all have officer ranks, you know, in their organization within their starship, and they all have their uniforms, and then they try to get the Star Trek celebrities to come in and talk. But I think that that world evolved out of fandom wanting more from it than other worlds in which the author may have put in more thought ahead of time, like Tolkien, like certainly Le Guin, George R.R. Martin being a super popular example these days. And, you know, he's not done creating his world for the Game of Thrones series known as Song of Ice and Fire.
You know, we get this cross-pollination, this enrichment of the creators to the fans and the fans back to the creators, in much the same way that science fiction inspires real-life scientists and scientists' work inspires science fiction. And there's sort of a mutual reinforcing process there. Should I touch upon the other elements of
keep going
of setting?
You're on a roll.
So I've got two other clusters here, and then we have other things we might say about this. But as we're talking about, like, the fans having influence over the creators of the setting, sometimes this kind of thing gets lampshaded, like as fans might question elements of setting that might not seem like they fit with the rest of, you know, with the canon that's been established for that particular franchise. It reminded me of the Last Action Hero, Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, where our young kid protagonist questions Schwarzenegger, who's like a movie character, but the kid is like a real life kid, and he's trying to figure out, you know, why are we in this world where there are phone numbers, all of which start with the exchange 555? and Schwarzenegger's character's response is, well, that's what we have area codes for. to make it so there are more phone numbers, right? Enough phone numbers for the whole world. Just sort of dismisses that. It's a little tongue-in-cheek kind of a thing, but it just goes to show how even the characters themselves need to have some rationale for why the setting has the elements that it does. It has to make sense. There has to be some internal consistency. Just as what was it one of Clark's laws that magic A is magic A? That was a name of a tvtropes.org page, where essentially whatever the rules are for the magic or whatever is happening in your story, it's got to follow them. It's got to be consistent. It can't just be arbitrary about them, or that's going to break your audience's willing suspension of disbelief. It's going to make them stop and realize, oh, wait a minute, that didn't make sense. And now they're no longer paying attention to the story and following along and being absorbed in that world as though it's real, right? You've taken them out of that. So whatever the rules are, there have to be rules, just like there are rules of physics, right? But if we saw the laws of physics being violated all of a sudden, we would question that.
When I was setting this up, you know, the very first item, that there's coherent and consistent logic in the world. The example that the author gave, this is all out of Wonder Book that I mentioned by Vandermeer, is Alice in Wonderland. Which, if you know Alice in Wonderland, you would think there's no logic there, but there is really, because it's absurd. But there are rules that are established, and they don't violate the rules. And the characters know the rules. When Alice enters the world, they explain. So, you know, sometimes a lot, like at the tea party, or sometimes a little, like the Cheshire Cat. But the rules are there. And so that was one of the things that we were playing with at NanoCon, was the difference between magic in stories that don't have rules, like Lord of the Rings and Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, two really good examples. You know, there's magic there, but you don't really see it very prevalently. Like what magic does Gandalf do? He doesn't really do any magic that we see. I mean, even the fight with the Balrog takes place mostly off camera. And Gandalf can't even fly to get out of the tower where Saruman has trapped him. He has to call the eagle. So there's some magic. He calls the eagle, but he doesn't do a lot of magic, and there are no rules to it. Song of Ice and Fire, George R. R. Martin is very much the same. There's magic, but it's kind of the flavor to the whole world, but there's no like system. Brandon Sanderson, who's one of the most popular fantasy writers right now, and he has several different book series, but one of them is the Mistborn series, and that has very well-established rules. The character is taught how to manipulate magic that's called allomancy, and it has to do with you have certain metal elements that inside your body that you use as fuel for your magical spells, and he spells out all the rules of the magic. Whereas you might think that J.K. Rowling's magic in the Harry Potter series has rules, but it really doesn't. The kids get trained. There are spells they can do, and there's some limits. There, which spells they can do and which spells they can't do, and they're going to school. But there's never a lot of explanation of there's no price to the magic.
That's not to say that the ways that magic is represented in these books are inconsistent
right
internally. It is just that the author's not making a point of making it look systemic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So authors that write about this stuff often refer to the Tolkien kind as soft magic and the Sanderson kind as hard magic. Whereas J.K. Rowling's is actually usually defined as somewhere in between, because there's some rules.
I think we learn more about the rules of how the wands work, really.
Absolutely.
And
how they're
spell
constructed.
casting. Yeah, how they choose their users and give them power and that kind of thing. Yeah. Speaking of magic, I'm rewatching a anime series called The Legend of the Legendary Heroes, and there are magics in that setting where the characters, in order to evoke the magic, have to utter certain incantations, and there are different sort of levels of formality of these incantations that signify magics that come from different countries, different cultures, and it's considered kind of a taboo or blasphemy to use some other culture's magic to utter their spells. Our main character has an alpha stigma, which is a special power of his eyes that allows him to see and read other people's magics and then be able to replicate them. And so he's kind of a taboo breaker in a sense, which makes him a pariah in the story. So, the ways in which magic functions signifies something about the cultures that we're talking about in this story. And it sets up this character as an alien, as an outsider, because of his ability to transgress, to cross those cultural boundaries.
And speaking of that, so I have two thoughts. One is that recently hanging out with one of the people that work over in e-learning, Danielle Casey, and she was talking about how she's so tired of fantasy novels that are set in a European medieval setting. This is the most common kind of basis for a fantasy world, sometimes based on England, sometimes more based on Germany, but those sorts of flavors. And she wanted to read more unique stories that are either based on other cultures or use another culture as a basis and really extrapolate from that. And so she and I were nerding out and mentioned N.K. Jemisin, who, if you're keeping track of stuff to read that gets mentioned here, N.K. Jemisin wrote a series called The Broken Earth series, the first book of which is called I always biff this, The Fifth Season. And she won the best novel award for the Hugo Award in science fiction, the 3 years running. So she did 3 books, and in 2016, 2017, 2018, those books in that 3-book series each won the best novel award. And the Hugos in science fiction are the People's Choice Award. So it's voted by the fans, and every year at the World Science Fiction Convention, they award all the different awards. for all the different categories. But the best novel is probably like the like the best movie Oscar kind of deal. Whereas there's another award that is granted by the science fiction writers. But one of the cool things that and I've only read the first book, and it's on my to-do list to read the other two by Jemison, is that it's a very different world than other kind of fantasy worlds. It's kind of a blend of fantasy and science fiction. It takes place on another planet, but it takes place on this supercontinent called the Stillness. And every few centuries in this world, the characters have to endure extreme climate change. And so there's this group of people called the Orangenes, who have the power to control energy and temperature and can cause and prevent earthquakes. Because of the climate change, they develop these abilities to allow the people to develop and to thrive. So there was my number one idea. And my number two idea, based on what Clint was just saying, is that our talk here doesn't have the same kind of structure as any other kind of talks I've ever done in community conversations, or any other talks maybe that you have experienced, because world building is not an exact science that you can follow an outline necessarily. It's all about where you start and what you develop. And then the authors are only going to show you so much of that in their stories. And that's one of the flaws of bad world building, is if they just dump all the detail on you so the characters get lost in the world.
Less is more, right, Chris?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, as I tell my creative writing students, you can include all kinds of details describing a character, describing a setting, but are they important to the story or not? Like, does it matter whether the character has blue eyes? Well, perhaps it does if blue eyes becomes the basis for some sort of discrimination in the story, or some element of the character's backstory that tells us something about where they come from, and therefore their relationships with other people. Maybe that is significant, but if it's not significant, then why mention it, right? You're just describing for the sake of describing.
So you could have too much setting, so it devours the characters. You could have these, fantastical devices and talismans that dominate all the other details, which is one of the things that's so great about J.K. Rowling, is that there's just enough specific detail, and it's repeated enough that you know what butterbeer is the next time she mentions it, and about the wands because it's mentioned multiple times, and the kids always go to Diagon Alley before they start school to buy their school supplies, because kids buy school supplies before they start school. And so that's a familiar thing. So there has to be a blending of familiarity, which is often why probably fantasy novels were often set in European medieval settings, because that was very familiar to all of us that read them in this culture. But also there has to be a sense of the strange. There's this really great, and if you're interested in writing or these kinds of things, there's this really great thing online you can get that the Science Fiction Writers Association has posted called the Turkey City Lexicon. And it's all these rules that science fiction and fantasy writers have created over the years that you don't want to break. And a lot of them were I should say science fiction writers and editors. And one of them is the Shmeep rule. And the Shmeep rule is one in which you just rename everything in our world with different names, so like you're reading the story and it's obviously a rabbit, but in this story it's called a Shmeep, and everything just has a different name. And it pretty much falls into these other categories where detail overwhelms the other elements, setting devours the characters, fantastical talismans dominate the other details, because you just have all these other names and you don't understand what any of these things mean.
I'll take that as a segue into mentioning the importance of place names, though. If you're thinking about the geography of your setting, place names can tell you something about the history and the culture and the peoples. I mean, even thinking about Mount St. Helens in the effort to rename it, what's the name going to be? Malala. That even having that sort of debate about how to name a place, right, has something to do with who has power in that setting, and what the cultural history and perhaps history of conflict or whatnot, or history of the peoples across time has to do with that. And if that has some sort of a significance or an effect on your story, then coming up with those kinds of unique names is meaningful and relevant. But yeah, to avoid Mount Schmeep, I guess. Thinking about place names, another cluster of elements of setting that you might take note of. We mentioned the geography, the map, and the terrain. Like, where do people live and why? What sort of constraints are present? Often the cities in the real world, right, get developed around sources of water, rivers, coastal areas, and so on. So what does where people live tell you about the nature of the people, whatever the people may be, human or otherwise, in your story? Are there cities? Why or why not? And how do cities evolve? And what does that imply? Buildings and dwellings, those are part of the physical setting, right? Not only as far as style, but function as well. The Fafford and the Grey Mouser story is taking place in Lankmar, right? And Lankmar itself is kind of a character in the setting, but because of the way in which buildings are structured, this is affecting how the characters can go about solving the problems that they're attempting to solve.
Lankmar is a huge sprawling city in a European medieval setting. One of the probably pinnacles in fantasy literature of a big, huge, sprawling medieval city. Certainly influenced George R. R. Martin with King's Landing and some of the other places in the Game of Thrones series.
Yeah, series of novels written by Fritz Lieber.
Yep, Fritz Lieber.
Yeah,
good stuff.
Natural resources, right? Thinking about natural resources and where do these come from? How's food produced? What's the environment like? What's the weather like? Thinking about weather today, because it started snowing again just before we came in. And how does that affect things? And then the other cluster I had was race and social class and hierarchy. How do these things play out in the different nations and the cultures of the world, or the spaceship, or whatever it is that you're developing your story in. Genders, people's gender identities and sexual identities, and the society's thoughts on those things, and how does that affect our characters in our society?
And doesn't Left Hand of Darkness deal with that to some extent?
It does. Left Hand of Darkness has our protagonist, Genly Ai, the ambassador he's from Earth, but he's representing the collection of worlds in contact with each other. And sorry, I didn't silence that. Worlds in contact with each other after the human diaspora, right? Everybody spreads out everywhere and loses contact because they don't have faster than light communication or travel. But they develop a communication technology that allows them instantaneous communication. And so now they've reestablished diplomatic relations. Genly Ai, our ambassador character, his job is to go to this newly rediscovered world, try to get the descendants of humanity there to agree to reestablish diplomatic relations. But what he comes to discover is, although he is gender binary and he's definitely male, the people here are androgynous. They don't have specific sex characteristics or gender, but they take on sex characteristics once a month for procreation and recreation. And that's really foreign to him. How can these people be both male and female and neither at the same time? And a lot of the drama of the story is driven by that setting detail that Genly Ai has to come to terms with this new or alien to him setting and culture and peoples, and what does that mean? And in what ways can I interact with these people that will allow me to achieve my diplomatic mission, but also just to get along with people.
So a couple things to riff on that, where we were going with that was, first of all, where people live. So water, typical. I mean, we know that our cultures originally came to being, or at least this is the main theory, around the Tigris and the Euphrates and the Fertile Crescent in what is now the Middle East. I'm currently reading and just almost finished with a book by another really popular science fiction writer by the name of John Scalzi. And if you love science fiction and you love science fiction with a humor bent, Scalzi is fantastic. And his brand new book is called the Kaiju Preservation Society. It's about this organization that protects the kaiju, which is the all-inclusive name for like Godzilla and Mothra and all these huge monsters that were created by the nuclear blasts and were featured in those movies in the 50s and 60s, right? And they live in this other dimension. And so this group goes there to protect them because they have biological nuclear reactors inside of them. So they let out nuclear belches, and they can go nuclear, they can explode, because they have this whole biological cooling system. So originally the Preservation Society camped out and put their bases by water, but the kaiju go to water to cool themselves off if they're about to have a critical meltdown. And they lost some bases this way. So then they stopped putting the bases near water. That was a bad idea. So, you know, all these things are interconnected. So once you start with an idea, whatever your starting point might be, that's going to then allow you to extrapolate all these other details about what makes sense logically within that world. So another example is a book I read a long time ago called The Algebraist by Ian M. Banks. He's a British writer. So think whales in space that live in the outer atmosphere of gas giants. If you want aliens that have very little relationship to things that are familiar to us. And they're known as slow seers because they experience time more slowly because of their environment and because of their biology than any other beings or creatures. And so that was obviously his starting point, you know, like, okay, I want to create something that would live in a, well, I don't know, I'm guessing that was obviously a starting point, live in the gas of a gas giant planet. And so then he would evolve from that and evolved a whole pretty cool story that came out of that.
Speaking of interesting ways to invent a story, Stephen R. Donaldson's creation of the Gap anthology, the series of 5 science fiction novels, his original seed for that story was just 3 character names: Morn Highland, Nick Sicorso, and Angus Thermopylae. And he thought, these are great names, and I want to have them be the hero, the villain, and the victim. And I want them to switch roles partway through the story. All of them. And so that's what he did. But then by just having that original seed idea, he had to develop a setting that would allow for that to happen, that would set up the beats in the story, that the characters would be put in positions to be able to have to face these certain challenges. And I'm not going to spoil the stories because I hope people will go and read them. They're really, really well-written stories. But with some not safe for work components, some very disturbing things happen in there, which
well, that would be consistent with Donaldson.
Change the victim to another victim. You know, people getting victimized. That's that's sometimes difficult to read.
Because in Thomas Covenant, so he's most famous for his Thomas Covenant books. And Thomas Covenant had leprosy, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I read.
And the setting,
is upsetting.
well, and the setting there is significant, not only because it's magical, but because Thomas Covenant gets transported to this world and doesn't believe that it's reality. And so he commits a lot of atrocities that he would not have done if he had thought of these people as real people rather than just, you know, a dream or something. And that comes back to haunt him. The decisions that he makes earlier in the novel have consequences for him later on in the novels. I just wanted to wrap up with the last couple of thoughts about these components of I mentioned gender, and I wanted also to mention people's power to change and control their bodies, right? What does the setting allow for personal freedom and power versus collective or authoritative power? What's the relationship between the people in their governments or social power structures, and diversity, and how the people in the society handle that more generally. Just another thing I wanted to mention about food, though, because I saw this in my notes. We talked about how even in like the movie Aladdin, food is critical. We start out with Aladdin having to steal food to survive, and he runs off to to avoid getting killed by the guards who are pursuing him, trying to enforce, you know, the capitalist power of the market, I guess. And when he escapes and is about ready to eat, he splits his bread with Apu, the monkey, and then he sees some starving children, and he kind of swallows his hunger and offers them his share of the food. And so the setting has enabled us to learn something vital about this character and his sense of honor and kindness that is told in a very economical way because of the situation that he's put in.
Yeah, so there's so much richness in the fiction that we like to read, you know, and it's very inspirational for creating our own worlds in fiction. You know, throughout my life, I've worked on what are now many unfinished projects, both for role-playing games or novels or comic books. And one of the things on the previous slide was making the story personal to you, even if it's a fantastical story of some kind. And one of the recent examples I came across for that was, again, George R.R. Martin, who visited Hadrian's Wall long before he started writing Game of Thrones. And it was just sort of in his mind, this giant, you know, fortification that he wanted to use in a story. And so that became, and this isn't too terribly a spoiler if you don't know these stories, that became the wall in the north in his Songs of Ice and Fire story. There's this huge 300-foot ice wall that is protecting the inhabitants of Westeros from basically zombies and other fantastical deadly creatures that are living really far in the, you know, Arctic wastes of the far north of the land, which, you know, really, if you think about it, is very much like England. You really have kind of like Lower England and Scotland, and the wall is kind of, you know, separating the two. It's the same sort of concept, but that made a huge impression on him, and it was a personal connection. And I keep coming across all of these kinds of things. Like recently, Mouse by Art Spiegelman has come back into the news because it was banned in a school. Mouse is the story of the German Holocaust in the middle 20th century with mice as the Jews. It's a graphic novel, so you know, drawings of mice, and the cats, and the Nazis are cats.
As all cats are.
Right, yeah, they're all Nazis. And Spiegelman, of course, is Jewish, and his I think it was his parents that were in the Holocaust, not his grandparents, because Spiegelman's a bit older than me. I don't know. He might have been his grandparents. I'm not sure off the top of my head. But obviously a story that comes from a personal place, and he constructed a world based on our world, but extrapolated from that. There's a couple examples.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe to wrap this up, we could go back to part of our description for this talk, which was that setting is integral to character and plot. If you know something about one, you should know something by implication about the other components. That all of these things are integrated, and as you are envisioning your characters, you can step back and ask, okay, what do these things about my character tell me about the setting in which this character lives and grew up and originated, and vice versa. Based on what I know about the setting, what does that tell me about the characters, and what kinds of story are possible for this person?
Right, exactly. So is this a good time to open it up for questions?
I think so. Have fun building your worlds. We'll take questions now.
All right. So does anybody have any questions they want to bring up?
How's it going? Okay, so
Hey.
there's a couple questions I got.
What's your name again?
Oh, Sean.
Sean, hi.
Hi.
Chris.
Hey. Have video games stunted growth of imagination regarding reading?
All right, say that again. What?
Have video games stunted growth of imagination regarding reading?
Oh, read.
Of just not in general of children, but in general of everybody reading.
All right. I'll let
Has
you
it
tell
limited that potential of growth of exploration that you guys were talking about? Or has it actually built upon and made it even better because you're visually able to see what's going on. I mean, at the beginning, there was nothing. It was like going back to the caveman days and that it was just pictures on a wall. So what's your opinion about that?
I'll let you take that one. So I don't play video games.
I do think that to some extent, our focus on visual and auditory culture through video games and film and television have tended to make fewer people readers these days, unfortunately. But I don't think that that is necessarily taken away from our imaginations by any stretch. I think if you look at really well-developed games, they have really well-developed story and characters. For example, Elden Ring right now is a super popular what's the word I'm looking for? Not precursor, but successor to the Bloodborne and Souls series, which is not games that I play, but one of my close friends does, and he's always very interested in talking about the depth and detail of the story that's embedded in the setting, and that produces sort of a richly imagined world. I think about games such as one of my favorites from the late 90s, Fallout and Fallout 2, where we have a setting and characters who are a product of the post-nuclear Holocaust America. And even though it's sort of an open kind of a sandbox type of a game, there are locations in the world where you have to go through and finish certain quests in order to get the story resolved. And all of these things are a product of the story. Like there's backstory here that you come to discover as you move through this world, and you develop an understanding of the characters. And just like we were talking about with the Star Trek example, right? That there's all kinds of sort of fan-made materials that expand the story from just what the video game Fallout gives you. So and another one of the benefits of that kind of a game, though, is that a lot of what you're presented is in text and not just in auditory form. But I would say either way, as long as it's using language and delivering a rich universe with characters who have agency, which is something that Le Guin's introduction to Left-Hand Darkness basically talks about, that well-written science fiction is the same as well-written fiction generally. Like, it has to be driven by characters who have agency, who have some control over their own destinies. And if we have that kind of rich storytelling, then I think that is productive of imagination, certainly not limiting of imagination.
But taking from your question about the reading part, though, I would say that in some cases, yes, video games have reduced the allure of reading or the attraction of reading. And I say some cases because I think reading, especially if it's an autonomous choice by a person, comes from the support of their environment. So if you have parents that value reading, if you have school that values reading, and it's promoting reading, then you're going to read. If you're in that environment, because reading is not going to be able to compete on an equal playing field with a game that's going to give you so much more dopamine in so much a shorter period of time. But I think we're living in a culture where so much reading material is being translated into movies and television and games and online things and streaming and all that kind of stuff, that I think it's promoting, that's also promoting reading. I think there's a good synergy there. Other questions? If you have a second.
Yes, regarding Fanfluence. So I remember when we first, well, actually it's speaking with my dad. Well, actually dad was speaking to me and my brother about Star Trek because we were interested in Star Wars, Star Trek and all that jazz. Well, Dad had a Pennsylvania Dutch accent and he had some missing teeth, but when it always came down to Spock, he always called him Spork. Okay. Now, but the time we got over here, James Doohan used to come down here once a year, the Longview Sign Autographs, a video warehouse, and that. My dad would always go talk to him about stuff because he was at the beginning of World War II, and my dad was at the tail end of it. So, but I always wondered because we always made fun of it, with the kids, everybody else in the neighborhood and that, and whenever we went, saw the parent teacher conference or something, and then come to find out we're watching the first Star Trek movie and I've, I, how they did the Vulcan language was that James Doohan just came up with something. He was like on the fly. I don't know. He's pretty good at
Accents.
languages.
Mhm.
So I always wondered if through the conversations my dad had with him, you know, did that get some kind of influence of saying, hey, this is how I'm going to pronounce sport, you know, probably on the fly at the last minute. But yeah, Fanfluence influence is a big thing. I can't guarantee that's what happened or how it happened, but that I just know personally that's how he used to say it, and it just lo and behold, it was in the movie. So
Thanks for sharing that anecdote.
You mentioned, my name's Neil.
Neil.
Excuse me.
I know.
I think it's the snow, you know,
Mhm.
and you
Pollen.
were talking about Europe. You know, I've traveled to Europe and stuff. And do you think the science fiction, the fantasy, all that stuff that is basically like Europe or kind of Europe is because of centuries of superstitions, dragons, this type of thing? Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? And a little bit in this country, but normally, you know, Scandinavia, maybe in Europe, it kind of brings all that stuff out. King Arthur and the Round Table, you know, and the dragons and the fire and all that kind of stuff. You know.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Tolkien is drawing on all of that mythology. You know, he's got elves, he's got dwarves. He invents he's got goblins. He invents some other kinds of characters and stuff. But you know, like you know, a lot of the German Ring saga from Wagner was a huge influence on Tolkien. And of course, that comes from a lot of the Norse mythology and the spread of the Viking people that were spread out way more than we believed. And then we keep finding more instances of how far they traveled and how wide their influence was. So absolutely, I think that you know, that is continuing being played out today.
Hello, my name is Joe.
Hey, Joe.
Good to see you again, Chris.
Good to see you too.
Question I'd like to ask is when you were explaining how to do a starting point when you're doing creating a world, Mr. Hull liked to state that if you were going to describe a character, you don't want to like just describe for just the sake of describing, but what if that is your starting point?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm always a fan of saying more than you need to in a rough draft because it's much easier to cut out of a rough draft than it is to have to add things that are missing.
Yeah,
Right.
because I was a little confused. So I was like, if that's like where you're starting, then how
Oh,
do you
yeah.
not know if like that's how you're going to include that later in the
That's
story
right.
then?
Yeah, you want to allow yourself the freedom to make those serendipitous discoveries as you go, and you don't know what's going to be important until you get it on paper and see it, right? And so, yeah, I was really referring there to what the final draft would look like, more so than what you would discover during a rough draft. Sure, describe the character in detail in the rough draft, and then when you get to the final draft, eventually you might have discovered that some of those details are unnecessary, and maybe some other details are, and then you make those adjustments as you go.
Because
Yeah.
the author is going to have a long, huge description of the character, either in his or her head or written down, and only reveal part of that. Like one of my, and I'm gonna express some shame here that I'm gonna tell you about a book here I've not read. So Octavia Butler, one of the greatest science fiction writers of the late 20th century, is on my list and on my list to read this, but I haven't read it, but it's a good example of the kinds of things we're talking about. So this is the first sentence of this novel, Wild Seed. Dora discovered the woman by accident when he went to check on, to see what was left of one of his seed villages. And this one sentence gives us so much information about the character. And then the subsequent paragraphs go on to describe a little bit of the character, but not too much. Because one of the main things that science fiction and fantasy readers have come to expect from their fiction is this idea of abeyance. You know, is the idea that I read this and I don't know yet what a seed village is. And I don't know why he discovered the woman by accident or why there's something left of the seed village. Obviously something's happened to the seed village, let alone who Doro is and what kind of a culture that name comes from. So I have lots of questions about this, but I'm going to stick a pin in these concepts and kind of hold up, you know, them in abeyance, knowing that the author is going to explain it to me, you know, but the explanation might not come quickly. It might come in little snippets. Because the mystery is always, well, not always, often more interesting than the explanation. So I think that's a constant thing that authors struggle with, is to, do they leave something a mystery by the end of the story, or do they explain the thing?
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for the questions and for our presenters, Chris and Clint. And please come back again next week.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Well, all right.